Henry, we're doing this video for the benefit of anyone who wants to see it later on, which includes the family, of course, friends or whatever. So this is a chance for you to tell the world who you are and your story, which is an interesting one. For the record, can I have your full name? Could you tell me your full name and where and when you were born?
Well, I'm Henry Bass, previously known as Heinz. I was born in Vienna on the 28th of November 1927. I think it was a Wednesday, and I was born at 4 o'clock in the morning. I was born in one of the best hospitals in Vienna, which I don't think my parents could afford, but nevertheless my mother was treated like a queen by my father, and he wanted the best for her. So it was in the Rudolfiner Heim, or home, which still exists in Vienna, one of the best maternity hospitals. My mother, unfortunately, I don't know whether you want me to carry on. When I was born, my mother had a stroke. She had a clot on the brain, and she was. The doctors gave up all hope for her, but she survived, and she became well again after a few weeks. And so I'm glad I had a mother in the end. I nearly lost her.
Wow. How old was your mother when this happened?
Mother was born 1899 and I was born 19, so she must have been 29.
Right.
Yeah.
So the medical treatment, the conditions of treatment out in Vienna must have been fairly good for the time, were they?
Yes, but at the time, strokes were always difficult cases when they didn't know how to treat strokes. There was no warfarin in those days, blood thinning treatment. But anyway, I was lucky I had a mother.
Did she completely recover?
My mother completely recovered, but my grandmother blamed herself for my mother's illness, and she refused to eat, and she died 6 months after I was born, and she had a miserable death as well. So
how could she have blamed herself for your mother's illness?
I don't know. That's all I heard from my relatives, that she thought she was to blame for my mother's illness. But how and why, I do not know. But it's the story anyway.
Tell me a little bit more about your mother. What sort of a person was she?
My mother was a very good-looking woman. From the photographs which I have, she was very nice-looking. She was very elegant. She was very jolly, she was very musical, she was a great cook, she was a very loving person. She enjoyed life to the full. Her life consisted of coffee houses, meeting friends in coffee houses, playing roulette in casinos, and going to the opera and to the operettas, which was her life, really. She was lucky she worked in the bank, and her boss always gave her opera tickets, and that's how she enjoyed the opera. And of course that filtered down to me, because in our home we only had a wind-up gramophone, there was no radio, there was no television, and my mother sang a lot, and that's how I picked up the music. And also because she liked to spend her time in coffee houses. In Vienna at that time, every coffee house had a little band. I got my musical knowledge from all these little orchestras, which I used to conduct at the age of 4 by standing in front of the bandstand and conducting the band. So life was very nice. I think the way I saw it, life was very nice. What financial problems they all had, I can't remember, but all I know is on Sunday everybody dressed elegantly. My mother never went out without a hat. She never went out without her gloves. My father never went out without his walking stick. And Sunday morning in Vienna, it was like a promenade around the Ringstrasse. Everybody greeted each other, and it was very nice. It was very nice. As I say, what financial problems they all had, I do not know. It was in 1929, there was the stock market crash, so everybody suffered in some way. I know I had to go and help out I went with my uncle to a food kitchen to help the poor Jews of Vienna. But there were miserable times for the poor people, because I remember we used to get a knock on the door, and there was a poor chappie. He was selling shoelaces, and the other one was selling other bits, worthless pieces, but that's how they made their money. They may have got only tuppence for selling a pair of shoelaces. But in our block, there were probably 30 flats, so that gave him 60 pence at the end of his trip. But that's how they lived, these people.
Right.
And we gave them, sometimes they took old clothes, whatever we could give, whatever we could afford to give them, they were happy with in those days.
Which part of Vienna were you living? What was the district or the area?
We lived in the second district, in the Hollandstrasse, which was one of the main thoroughfares through Vienna. Hollandstrasse, I think it was named after the Dutch in gratitude to Holland for sending food after the First World War. And they called it the Hollandstrasse. It'd be interesting to you. It wasn't a very elegant street, but they were full of Jewish delicatessen shops, and there was Jewish delicatessen shops. What else was there? A laundry, and round the corner was this school. The school was a Jewish school, but it took in Catholics as well. For some reason, and we were about 50-50, 50% Jews, 50% Christians in the class. We used to walk to school. Vienna had a very nice life. In the summer, we all went swimming, and we could rely on the weather. We knew that tomorrow was going to be a nice day in the summer, and we knew when the snow was coming, and from our window in the house we could see a little ice skating ring, and there was nothing better than waiting for the snow to come down so we could go skating in the winter. And the children had a wonderful life. Everybody was on ice skates in the winter. We went ice skating. In fact, Denise and David, we all been to the same ice rink in Vienna, and it's still there 100 years after it started. It was a very nice life for children.
Now, tell me a bit about the Bass family. They've got a very interesting background too, haven't they?
Yeah. My father married my mother I think in 1926. He came from Lemberg in Poland, but as Poland used to belong to the Austrian Empire, they were free to come to Vienna backwards and forwards. And my father had an agency, and he traveled to Vienna, he traveled to Germany, Czechoslovakia. He was an agent for all these countries. And he married my mother. I think they met at a tea dance. My mother was a very good dancer. My father was an excellent tango dancer. And this is how they met at the tea dance. I think my father showed my mother his bank book, and she said yes. and they got married.
Was that normal in those days?
I think that was the condition she married him. She wanted to see his bank book. The name, the family name, I do not know how it came about, but my grandmother's name was Reif. And my father was known, no, I'm sorry, I made a mistake there. My grandmother's name was Bas. Her maiden name was Bas. The grandfather's name was Reif. And when my father married my mother, he changed his name to Bas. And I do not know why. There is no indication in the registration books in Vienna. We've looked it all up. It just said he changed his name. And underneath is the date of my birth as well. So he must have done it the week I was born. So, that is the... There were lots of Basses. My father had a brother in Vienna, but there were lots of cousins from Poland who used to come to Vienna shopping for weekends. Sometimes the weekends extended 2 months, and they were a lovely family. They were very, very good looking also. The Polish women, they were all blonde and had blue eyes. They were gorgeous. And I don't remember much about them, but I remember they always used to come. They used to bring me presents. I was the only boy in the family. And in fact, I was the only child in the family. There were none of the other uncles or cousins had children, so I was the only one. They made a great fuss of me.
What was your father's first name?
Marcus. Max. He was known as Max, but his name was Marcus.
And going beyond your father to your grandfather, tell me a little bit about grandfather Reif, I think it was, wasn't it?
I don't know anything about them. No, we're stuck there. I do not know anything about that family at all. All we know is my mother's side of the family, which is the tree, which I've drawn out. That is all my mother's side. I don't know anything about my father's side of the family.
Tell me a bit more about your mother's side. There was a rabbi, apparently, wasn't there?
Yeah, originally, the family tree goes back to about 1826, and there was a Hermann Rimmler. He was the first one who we know about. He was a rabbi, and he was a judge, and he had 9 children, and he had 8 daughters and 1 son, I think, and he made them all beautiful weddings, from what I hear. And he really was the founder of the family, and the tree goes back to him. We can't go back any further, unfortunately. Had Poland not been in the Eastern Bloc, we would have probably gone and look up the registers there.
Was your family a religious family?
My father was a religious man, inasmuch he laid the film every morning when he got up. When he was in Vienna, we used to go to synagogue on Friday nights. We did not keep a kosher house, but my mother lit candles. And he wanted a Kaddish saga. He wanted somebody who would say Kaddish when he died, and that was me. Unfortunately, I didn't turn out the way he wanted me to be.
How do you think he wanted you to be?
Well, as I say, he wanted a Kaddish saga, and because I came to England and lived with Christian people, my religion was a bit disrupted.
Right. Okay. Now, what sort of memories, childhood memories, do you have of growing up in Vienna? What are some of the earliest memories that you can recall?
I remember Vienna, as I say, we had a summer and a winter, and in summer we packed up the suitcases, we packed up the cutlery, we packed up pots and pans, and we went off 3 months to a rented house in Baden. In winter, it was winter, and we look forward to ice skating. My only impression, I've got about 2 or 3 impressions. One was my first memory of an appendicitis operation, which you haven't got down there, where I had terrific pains and I was sent to hospital, and in those days it was really frightening, and it's never left me, the memory of that, where I was strapped onto the table and a mask placed over my face. And I remember my Uncle Jacques, he came into the operating theatre and he said, "Stop operating on this boy, I don't want him operated on." But that was the first thing I remember. The second was the second operation, which was my adenoids. And things got better by that time. They did not strap you down, but nevertheless, they still put a mask over your face. And the third one, I remember, was my tonsil operation, where I walked to the specialist and I sat on the nurse's lap, and she held my arms behind my back, and they operated and took my tonsils out there and then. And I walked home 10 minutes after the operation. And these are the things I do not forget. You know, I've never forgotten that.
right.
It was a frightening experience.
A bit traumatic, was it?
Yes, yeah. In those days.
Yeah, for a kid, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, your father, you said, had an agency. Was he sort of like a traveling salesman, or what did he do?
Yes, I think he was. I never knew what he sold. All I know is that father was away many weeks of the year. And this had a miserable effect on my mother and on me. There was never, when we wanted him, there was never a father in the house. He was away. There was no telephones. Although we had a telephone, it was murderous to get through to Poland or Czechoslovakia. You know, you couldn't dial like you do now.
So did it have an effect on you, the fact that your father wasn't around a lot? Do you think?
Yeah, it must have done. I was a terror in the block of flats. Nori Sobel's father used to come down and say, "Where is Heinz? He's hit my daughter again." But I missed having a father. Yes.
But how often would he come home? Say, you know, he said he was away a lot, but would he come for 4 weeks at a time? Say, when he did come back, or?
Yeah, he came. He used to come back for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks at a time, and then he was off again for weeks.
Wow.
Yeah.
What relationship did you have with your father then, in that case?
I had a religious. All I remember really is I had a religious relationship with him, because when he was in Vienna, I remember that was the only time I went to the synagogue with him, because he always went. We used to go to the Seitenstätten temple, which is the main synagogue in Vienna, and also the Polish synagogue, where he knew everybody who came from Poland, and they were all his friends. And as I say, on Sundays we all used to parade around the Ringstrasse, mother, father and me.
Was he the sort of man, though, you could confide in, as you know, your problems as a child?
I really can't remember those days, what I spoke to him about. He used to tell me a lot of war stories from the First World War, because he was a soldier in the First World War. But our relationship, I really can't remember it. I remember my stepfather's relationship with me much better, because it was later on.
Sure, sure. And how did your mother feel about the fact that your father was away so much? I mean, how did she fill her time and so
on? I think my mother spent the times in coffee houses. She had a nice social life, even without my father. She went to the coffee houses and met all her friends. She used to go to Baden, to the casino, which was an hour's ride on the tram from Vienna, and she went to concerts and to the opera on her own. And then in 1935, I think it was, she met Armin. Armin was, she said he was a good-looking guy at the time, and he was an architect in Vienna, and his sisters had a very nice business running one of the biggest sweet shops in Vienna, and he started taking my mother out, and he took her for drives. He had a motorcycle at the time with a sidecar, and we all went for drives to Baden and driving around Vienna in the summer. And this was became a serious relationship, I think. They weren't going to, my parents were not getting divorced, but it was a serious relationship. Whether my father knew about it, I do not know. But certainly one evening, my mother invited Armin for dinner to our home, and my father returned unexpectedly from one of his trips, and there was an almighty row, I remember, and I was pushed into the other room, and the door was slammed on me, so I shouldn't hear what was going on. And this was the beginning of the relationship with Armin.
Right, right. So was this the reason that your father, you think, he left later on when the war came, or when he decided to go? Well, after Hitler came to Vienna,
we had to decide, my mother decided where we were going to go. And my mother got a permit, a work permit, to come to England as a domestic servant. And father did not get a work permit to come to England. Being just an agent was something that the British just didn't want. He couldn't contribute to anything here. So he went to Bratislava, hoping to come to England later on, but that never happened. Father didn't leave Vienna because of Armin or my mother's relationship. He left Vienna because all the men were being arrested in Vienna and shipped off to Dachau. And he thought it was safer to go back to Czechoslovakia. He had a permanent visa to go backwards and forwards to Czechoslovakia.
Sure. Okay, we'll get to all that in more detail later on, actually, the war years. Tell me about the Jewish life in Vienna when you were growing up there. What was it like? Where did they live? Which synagogues did they go to? All that sort of thing.
Well, the second district where we lived was basically all Jewish. Every shop was practically Jewish. We lived in an apartment house. I think there were about 30 or 50 different flats. They were all small flats, 2 rooms, 2.5 rooms, with the water tap outside on the landing. And most of the families were very, very poor. And there were several families living in these 2 rooms. There were certainly 2 and 3 families with 3 or 4 children living in 2 or 3 rooms. And I remember we used to go down the street because there was a sauerkraut shop there and the gherkin shop here and a chicken shop here. And down the bottom of our street was Carmelita Market, was the local market where on Fridays, they used to bring the fresh carps along and have them in little pots, and they used to bring live chickens. There were little women sitting with their baskets selling eggs and cheese, and everybody knew everybody else. They used to say, "Hello, Heinzie, what do you want this week?" You know. The schools we used to have, there were, as I say, we used to be quite a lot of Jewish boys in the school. And on Wednesdays, the rabbi used to come around and he used to give lessons to the Jewish boys. And on Fridays, I think the Catholic priest used to come and speak to the boys. Saturday, the whole place was dead. There was nothing open on Saturday in that area. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, there was nothing going on at all. Nothing was open except the cafes, because the cafes were turned into synagogues. On the high holidays, there were not enough seats in the synagogues. Although Vienna had 48 synagogues, there were not enough seats for everybody who wanted to go. And so the cafes were turned into synagogues, and somebody got up and pretended to be the rabbi. And that's how it was. Sundays was a very nice day. Sunday was very nice because Sundays I used to have to go out with the maid. My mother and father, after they took me for a walk Sunday mornings, they wanted to be free for the rest of the day, and I went out with the maid. And the maid usually had a date with her soldier friend, and this soldier used to come in his full dress uniform, knock on the door, and click his heels, and I used to go with him and the maid, and we used to go in the Prater, which was the amusement park in Vienna. Now, certainly it had a lot of roundabouts, and every cafe in the Prater had a military band, and the place was full of music. It was fantastic, really. But in those days, there was an elegance. Even the maids who went out on their free day, they dressed up beautifully, especially if you had a boyfriend who was a soldier in full dress uniform. You couldn't come out with jeans with him.
So there are very famous coffee shops and hotels in Vienna, like the Sacher Hotel.
Yeah.
And there's wonderful cakes and everything else. Tell me a bit about that kind of side of it.
Yeah. Well, the Sacher Hotel in 1935, 36 it still looked the same as it does now. It was a very elegant hotel, and only elegant people ever went there. They went there with their hats, with their best suits, with their gloves, and we were the children. Even we were beautifully dressed, and the mothers and parents used to sit around and chat and chat and chat. With one coffee and a cake, you could sit there all the afternoon, and they didn't push you out. And it didn't cost anything. And the children, they were given a little blackboard and chalk or drawings, and we kept ourselves amused drawing while the parents chatted. It was a very nice time. Of course, the Sacher Hotel is famous for its chocolate cake, mit Schlag, with whipped cream, and it's one of the nice things in Vienna. There were lots of other coffee houses. There were thousands of coffee houses. In the Volksgarten, for instance, there was a very big open coffee house which had a dance band, and they had a tea dance. In Kursalon, im Stadtpark, there was a tea dance. So a lot of these restaurants or coffee houses on Sunday afternoons had tea dances where people met.
Right.
It was a nice time.
Now, you had an uncle called Jacques. Tell me a bit about him. What was his last name, Jacques?
Jacques Rimmler.
Rimmler.
Yeah, that's how the Rimmler family came down. Uncle Jacques, he was a very good-looking man. He was the oldest of the three children, and he supported my grandmother when the grandfather died. Uncle Jacques used to spend his time in coffee houses, but he did his business in the coffee house. He wrote all his letters there, he wrote his invoices there, and he had his table which was reserved for Jacques Rimmler. Uncle Jacques married Gusti Stößel. Gusti was a lovely woman, and if Denise and David will see this, they loved Denise and David, especially the times that we spent in Israel with them. And Gusti had a beautiful face, although she was a very plump lady, but she liked her Marillenknödel, and she was an excellent cook. And she had a milliner business in Vienna. And they worked from home. Everybody worked from home in Vienna, practically. And she employed 6-7 girls, and she worked from her house, from her flat. She had a 6-room flat, and all customers used to come to the flat to have their hats made. In Vienna, most of the people who had money had their hats made. You didn't go into a shop and buy a ready-made hat. Everything was made to measure. Dresses, coats, suits, hats, everything. I think even corsets in those days were made to measure. I remember I used to go with my mother while she was being fitted with a new corset. Everything was handmade. And Gusti worked hard, and I spent many holidays with them. We went driving into the country. And Uncle Jacques was one of the first to have a car in Vienna. It was an open 7-seater car, which had to be started with a starting handle every time. You weren't allowed to talk to him. When it rained, he had to get out and put the roof up. But it was great fun time. Uncle Jacques, because he was a very good-looking guy, he had a girlfriend on the side, Putzi Sprinzelis, who I was very friendly with, and my mother was very friendly with her, and she was a very nice person. And they carried on their relationship even after emigration to America. Putzi also emigrated to New York, and they carried on while my auntie worked.
Right. What happened to Jacques later on?
Yeah, Uncle Jacques, he liked his chocolate cakes. He liked all the sweet things in life, and he got diabetes, and this was an incurable thing probably, but the doctors told him not to eat sweet things and cut down and give himself injections and so forth. He didn't take very much notice, and one day one of his toes became septic, and they had to take off the toe. But it didn't stop there, and in the end he had both legs amputated, and also he went I think 60 or 70% blind at the same time. When he died, my auntie only had $100 left after paying for all the doctors in New York, and it was a very sad time, because when he emigrated, his great wish was to get me out of England and get me to come to New York. He always thought I would have a better start in life in New York, and he was going to send me an affidavit. But my mother didn't want me to go to New York, because at the time the Atlantic was full of U-boats and every ship was practically sunk and there was no other way of going. The lovely story after that was that one day my auntie was walking along in New York when an old friend of hers said, "Hello, Gusti, how are you?" And she said, "Well, I've just lost Jacques." And he said, "I've lost my wife as well." I can't remember her name for the moment. "And what are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to Israel to meet my mother, to visit my mother." And he said, "Can I come too?" And she said, "Well, come along." And he went along, and a few months later they married. And Arthur Rupp, he was originally an old boyfriend of my mother, so they knew each other. But for the rest of his life, although his name was Arthur, she called him Jacques. And we had beautiful evenings in Tel Aviv with them at their home in Tel Aviv. Arthur was an art restorer and a pianist, and we had lovely piano evenings in Tel Aviv, which I hope the niece will always remember.
Henry, the Jews in Vienna you've described the way they lived, most of them were poor,
yeah.
But there was a hell of a lot of culture there, wasn't there? Tell me about the cultural side of Jewish life there. Well, I was only 11 or 12, so I do not remember a lot, but I know there were 48 synagogues in Vienna. I think there were 48 Jewish newspapers a day, some in Hebrew, some in Yiddish, some in English, most of them in German. There were, if I look up now, the organizations what were in Vienna in 1938. There was the Jewish Witzo, there was the Jewish Hakoah, which was the most famous sporting club in Europe at the time. In fact, the Hakoah football team beat England in 1936. There were the Hakoah swimming club. There were so many organizations. Don't forget, Vienna had a population of 180,000, of a Jewish population, and there were so many organizations everywhere. We had Jewish hospitals. I think there's only one in London now in the East End, but Vienna had their own Jewish hospital. Nobody ever went into a Christian hospital. Jews went into Jewish hospitals. There was a lot of, the Kultusgemeinde ran Vienna. Everything went through the Kultusgemeinde. It's a terrific organization. And then there were Jewish musicians. Martha Eggert, Jan Kippur, these were the opera singers. They were Jewish. You asked me quickly, I can't remember the others. But all the pianists, the violinists, Nathan Milstein, the Jewish composers, Kurt Weill, the Jewish conductors at the opera, the whole life revolved around the Jews. Bruno Walter, famous Jewish conductor, he was the principal conductor of the Vienna Opera. Gustav Mahler was Jewish, but he had to change his religion in order to get the job as conductor at the opera, so he became a Catholic. talking about anti-Semitism in Vienna, how virulent was it? I mean, what was your personal experience of it as well?
Well, I think we had a very famous Burgermeister who was really anti-Semitic. Nobody got a job in any of the ministries if you were Jewish because of this Burgermeister. Then the Catholic Church in Vienna was very strong and powerful, and they must have preached anti-Semitism, that their Lord was crucified by Jews. And so this spread in Vienna. You had a lot of symbols of anti-Semitism on churches. Some of the roofs had anti-Semitic symbols on it, like Jews with long noses, and this was part of the architecture on the churches. And it manifested right down to the children. If we did anything wrong in class, the Catholic would say, "Sauyut," or "dirty Jew," or they used to spit at us. We got so used to it, being called Jews and nasty Jews and dirty Jews, that here when we get a little bit of anti-Semitism, it just runs off my back because they don't know what it is. Vienna was a very anti-Semitic city because there were a lot of prosperous Jews there. And as I said before, the Jews were in opera, they were in the arts, they had the best shops, they owned the biggest department store in Vienna, Gerngross and Herzmansky. They were rich people. Most of the Jewish women wore fur coats in the winter. I mean, Vienna, when it gets cold, it was freezing, and people wore fur coats. And of course, the others, the anti-Semites, resented this, that they had so much money and the others were starving. So it wasn't pleasant, but we all got used to it, and nobody cared anymore. But then in 1938, it really started.
What do you remember about the time when Hitler marched in on the 13th of March 1938?
I remember the day before, everybody in Vienna, really all the men and lots of children as well, they wore little red, white, red little ribbons in their lapels, because there was Chancellor Schuschnigg. He wanted to have a plebiscite of whether Austria should join Germany. And in the end, this plebiscite was cancelled, and it never took place. And the next day, the Germans marched into Austria. And I remember the next day, all these little red, white, red ribbons disappeared, and everybody wore their little swastikas. Vienna, most of them were Nazis. The population were all Nazis and anti-Semites. And Hitler marched in, and I remember the next day, there was a giant parade of German soldiers on the Ringstrasse with tanks. The airplanes flew overhead. A few days later, I even remember I saw Hitler on the Ringstrasse. We did not know what was going to happen a day after. And so straight away, that next day, out came the swastika flags. And Vienna doesn't have flagpoles like we have in England, where we have these tiny little flags. They have these 30-foot, 40-foot long flags hanging down buildings. And the whole city really was red with a swastika in the middle. The opera had all these swastika flags. And even our house, the porter must have put out the swastika flag, because we had a swastika flag flying from our house the day after Hitler marched into Vienna. So they were all prepared for it, except I think the Austrian government did not allow them to fly these swastika flags beforehand. But the day after the Germans marched in, they were all out. The city was all red. The first thing what happened, the religious-looking Jews, that's the Jews with beards and payas, they were rounded up in bunches or in parties of 10 or 20, and they were made to scrub the pavements. At the same time as Austria was going to have the plebiscite, they also the Austrians painted the pavements with the Kruppenkreuz. It wasn't the Hakenkreuz, it was not the swastika, it was the other cross that Austria had. And the Germans made, and the Gestapo made the Jews get down on their hands and knees with scrubbing brushes and toothbrushes and scrub the pavements. Then they were hauled off in lorries. And I saw this, but you know, every time we saw a bunch of people scrubbing streets, we made a big circle around and went the other way. We all went, we tried to avoid these people in case we got arrested. So Mother always took me along. Wherever she went, she took me. She thought she was safer with a little child. She would not be arrested. The first thing really was that the Germans took over the Metropole Hotel, a giant hotel, and this was turned into the Gestapo headquarters in Vienna, and the Imperial Hotel on the Ringstrasse was turned into the German Army headquarters. And we avoided walking on the side of these like the plague. If you were taken to the Metropole Hotel, I don't think you ever came out. You weren't released back on the streets, certainly. Metropole Hotel had a deep basement, and this became the torture chambers. And afterwards, people were sent to Dachau concentration camp from there. A few returned. Anyway, so these were the first few days. Then the restrictions came in force. Everywhere were well, what they did first, they used to paint all the Jewish shops with Mogen Duvitz, and wrote Jude down, and do not buy from Jewish shops. So that was the main thing. Do not buy from Jewish shops. And the owners had to stand outside the shop, and they had to turn away people, turn away customers, because this was in force. We were then not allowed to go anymore into the parks. We were not allowed to sit on park benches. Every bench had, not for Jews not allowed to sit on here. Swimming pools, Jews weren't allowed. The coffee houses, the Sacher Hotel, our favorite place, Juden unerwünscht, which means Jews are not welcome. And consequently, they restricted the movements where you could go and where you couldn't go. And in the end, there was not very much where you could go. By that time, I already went to a Jewish school, which was attached to a Patzmoniten synagogue. And every day there was a battle to get into the school and coming out of the school. The Hitler Youth, some of them as big as Sam, but with short trousers and their tie in a knot and a black leather stripe across them. These were the sort of boys that we had to run the gauntlet from. Boys size of Benjamin and Sam. There were there were no soldiers or policemen who tortured us or wanted to hit us. It was these little 12-year-olds and 15-year-olds. And they came every day to the school in the afternoon with a bag full of stones. And they were waiting for us to come out of school. And then they started throwing stones. And we had to run the gauntlet. There must have been about 50 or 60 of these boys.
Did you get hit by any of the stones?
No, I didn't get hit. You know, some of the boys who couldn't run, they were beaten up by a baton probably. But there was a big house next to the school, and I ran into that house several times, and I ran upstairs and I just rang the bell on the first door where somebody could open, and asked them if they could hide me for a couple of hours until all these boys disappeared, which they did. And I walked home afterwards. But this happened every day for many weeks. But in the end, it got too much, and I think they closed the schools. The Nazis ordered Jewish schools to be closed. Also, the teachers weren't allowed to teach children anymore. So without teachers, we couldn't go anyway.
Right. So you could feel this as a child, all this oppression was starting to happen.
Oh yeah.
How did it affect you personally?
Well, we were all scared. We did not dare hit back at these children, at these Nazi Hitler Youth children, and we were scared out of our lives. It was a frightening time. It was a frightening time because at night the Gestapo would come into our house and they would bang on. Number one, you could hear them with their jack boots on the concrete. Then they used to bang hard at the door, open up, and they used to come in and search the apartment or our flat. They used to open the wardrobes, throw everything out onto the floor, and where's Mr. Bus? And my mother used to say he's away travelling at the moment. But had he been there, he would have been arrested. And then went from one flat to the other. Both the second district, wherever they knocked on the door, there was a Jewish family, with the exception of the porters or the housekeepers who were Christian.
So you must have been quite scared as a child about all this.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you terrified, in fact?
I think so. I think we were all very scared, especially at night. My father was away, so it was just my mother and I. And there's knocking on the doors. Even when they didn't knock on our door, they knocked on somebody else's. It was frightening. Now then, this went on for months. When they came, they came in March 1938. So for the 9 months, we had to take this. And there were loads of restrictions. People were frightened of getting arrested in the street. It was a hell of a time in Vienna. What the Germans failed to do in Berlin in 1933, or in those 6 years, they really did in 2 or 3 months in Vienna. Vienna had a system where the Kultusgemeinde had records of all the Jews in Vienna, had all the names and addresses in alphabetical form, and the Germans went there, looked up the registers, and they really arrested the people in alphabetical order.
So you were pretty early on the list, with the name starting with B.
Yeah, well, again, depends what they looked at, whether they looked at births or marriages or the Jewish community, how they were registered. But and then, of course, started the immigration. I can't remember now all the things which went on in Vienna. Everybody was talking about where they're going to go, what are they going to do, where can they go. The Karmeliter market, who I mentioned earlier, that market, that is still surrounded by 5-story blocks of flats. And people who had no chance of getting out, they just threw themselves out the window. They either gassed themselves or they threw themselves out the windows. These were people who had absolutely no chance of getting anywhere because they were stateless, they had no passports, they had no documents, and just people couldn't take it. Where the husband was arrested and taken to Dachau, the wife was left, she threw herself out the window. It's perfectly true. I don't know what made us decide on England. Well, I know why. You may have to cut this out. I think Mother decided to come to England because Armin was going to England, okay? And so she applied to an English family in Beaconsfield, whether they would employ an Austrian maid who is a very good cook, who is excellent at cleaning, marvelous at ironing, and a hard worker. My mother has never done any ironing, she did very little cooking, and she did no cleaning at all. And they offered to send her a permit to come to England. My mother wrote that she had a little boy, and they said, okay. they wanted to help Jews. The English people wanted to help Jews, so they sent a permit. Armin, as I say, he left Vienna and he came to England. His 3 sisters, who owned a sweet shop, they had all their windows smashed in, and the 3 sisters were arrested and taken to Theresienstadt. And I've got here the book of the victims of Theresienstadt, and they're all in there, and they were all murdered in Theresienstadt. We had next door to us in our flat, we had mother's cousin, and she was married, and they recently had a little baby in 1938, and they had no papers either. And it's amazing, and when you think back, why these people didn't have any documents. They had no passport. Well, they were probably all illegal immigrants into Austria in the first place. To get somewhere else, they had no documents. And they went illegally over the border. Now, illegally over the border, I don't know if you've been to Vienna, Austria and Czechoslovakia, what happened was you got a taxi, and the taxi took you as close to the border as he could, and then you started walking across the fields and hoped that you would land up in Czechoslovakia. You knew the direction, and they went in the middle of the night, and Mum's cousin, I remember they went 3 times with this baby. They left Vienna at 6 o'clock in the evening, took the taxi to Czechoslovakia or to the Austrian border, and 3 times they were back in the morning because they were either arrested or turned back, or they couldn't find their way, or they didn't have a guide. But 3 times they came back, and the 4th time we don't know what happened. They either got across, hopefully, but they're probably murdered anyway because none of our relatives ever tried to contact me. So, and I don't know where they are.
But to get out of Vienna, you also needed an exit visa. So how was that arranged?
Well, first, before the issued visas, all Jews had to declare their income and savings and whatever they had in the bank. And there's an office in Vienna to this day where you can look up your family's name, and they will tell you what income was declared in those days. Of course, most of the Jews didn't declare their income. And we've been there to this office. They couldn't give me any information because the Austrians are terrible. They say, we have such slow computers that we cannot give you the information that you want today. But if you come back in a month's time, we may be able to produce it. But anyway, all the people who had businesses, they had to declare the value of their property, the value of the money in their bank deposit account, and then they had to pay the taxes first. Once you paid your taxes, you had to get an exit visa. And that happened, we had to go to the Austrian Home Office to get an exit visa, and also we had to go to the Kultusgemeinde, to the Jewish, because the Jewish had all the information. In Austria, all the information was of Jews, like births, marriages and death, was held by the Kultusgemeinde, the Jewish organization. Here in England, it's held by the state, but in Austria, it was held by the Jews. Okay, so we had to go and queue up at the Kultusgemeinde to get all our Jewish information. That means a lot of people had to go there, get copies of birth certificates, copies of their marriage certificate. Nobody could leave without all this information. We needed that into the country where we were going. So there were long queues formed at the Kultusgemeinde. I remember we just stood there from early one morning till the afternoon, but we were lucky. We had an uncle who worked there, and Uncle Stößel, and he got us all the information that we needed. But what the Germans did to demoralize the people even further, the people who queued there day and night, they were dispersed by the Nazis, so they lost their place in the queue. You know, some were arrested again, some were taken out of the queue, left out, and this was to make them even queue longer. And then came the really big thing, where we had to go to the German passport office in Vienna and get a German passport. I already had an Austrian passport, but we had to have the German passport, and the big thing in that was had to have the J in it, which stipulated that you were Jew. And even though you were going to leave the country, they still put this Jew, they stamped the J in it. My passport, as you will see, was valid for one journey out of Austria, and I could not return. We managed to get the exit visas. We had all the documents. We had no money. Father went to Czechoslovakia. He took the money with him, what we had, the bank books he took with him. And as we were coming to England, and we could only take £5 with us, we took £5. Mum sold she sold the silver, she sold the china, she sold the furniture, she sold the beds, and the Nazis or the Christians came, and they said, well, we've got enough Rosenthal china now, this is worthless, we've got enough silver now, we've got enough furniture now. They didn't want to give you anything for your furniture. And in the end, the furniture, we gave it away or we sold it, and it was taken by horse and cart away. And we locked the front door and left the key in the lock, and we came away.
And how did you feel about all that, having to leave your home?
I think I don't know. We were all so frightened that we were glad to get away. We couldn't go to school anymore. We couldn't go in the parks. The Jewish children couldn't play anymore on their own. They had to be escorted everywhere by their children. So we really were glad to get away in the end. The sad thing was that a lot of children had to come to England on their own without their parents. Nori, my friend from Florida, she was put on a Kindertransport train and brought to London, and she lived here with a family, and her parents were lucky. They followed her 6 months later, I think. I came away with my mother, so I had the support of my mother, and I wasn't so frightened. But the journey itself was a nightmare. We left Vienna, I think it was 10 o'clock in the evening, from Westbahn railway station. The train was absolutely crowded, all with refugees. Stank to hell. Everybody bought salami sandwiches and cucumbers and gherkins and food for the night and the next day. And the Gestapo checked every passport, every visa, checked how much money we all had. They went through your suitcases. It took about 2 hours before the train got moving because the inspection. Then there was another inspection at Munich when we crossed the border into Germany. And there the train halted, and a few people got off and never came back. And then through the night we went through Germany. And one thing that sticks in my mind was a lady there who had a gold watch, and she threw it out the window because you were not allowed to bring out any jewelry. And she was frightened of being caught with this gold watch. Unbelievable. So all that night, all through the night, the people, they didn't speak, they didn't do anything, just remained silent. And it was not until the next morning, I think it was 7 o'clock when we crossed the Dutch border, the train went to Flushing in Holland. And that's when we felt free. We could talk and we could sing and whatever we did. And here we come, sort of thing, Great Britain.
You're one of the fortunate ones to leave Austria because a lot of people didn't get out.
Yeah.
How do you look back towards that? I mean, how do you feel about your fortune, if you like?
We're going to come to the story of my foster parents later on. And she always said to me, Heinz, you were one of the chosen people. And I said, what do you mean, Ina? And she said, Heinz, God chose you to come to England. God chose you to come and live with us. And always remember, she said, you were one of the chosen people. And she was right. Yeah.
Because if you'd stayed, you would probably not be here today. Neither would David, would Denise, nobody.
Right.
You wouldn't have met Vera. So,
yeah.
In a way, do you think fate is played a part in your life in that way?
I'm not religious. I don't know whether I believe in God or not. You see, all the people who we knew who believed in God and didn't have visas, they perished in Auschwitz. God will help us. God will help us. God will help us. And God did not help them, and they died. God, if there is a God, probably helped me become one of His chosen people to come to England. And what can we do? We can only say thank you that I met Vera, and we had Denise and David and Sophie and Noah and Ben, and the little family started again. At least this is the first time we've ever had any children in the family, grandchildren.